had it. Basically, you're awake but you can't move, and sometimes experience auditory and visual hallucinations. I was aware of this, so I didn't have a full-on heart attack when I started hearing shuffling noises outside my tent, which continued and got louder and closer until the fabric of the tent itself was being touched by something. My computer hadn't died yet, and I could see my surroundings in the dim light off the screen. I watched the fabric compress as something pushed against it sporadically about 4 feet off the ground, then moved around the tent towards me. I watched 3 distinct impressions follow this creature around the side of the tent. It looked like a claw. I was terrified and filled with adrenaline, but another part of me remained calm, assuring my body it was all a dream. I couldn't do anything, so my fear was pointless. But I continued to observe it, and my sleep paralysis began to fade, and I realized I could move. No longer so was I convinced I was dreaming. I reached over and shoved Luke awake. I tried to get him to look, to see if there was really something out there. But I must have sounded like I was sleep-talking because he just rolled over and went back to sleep, waving me off. Eventually the rustling stopped, and I was tired and groggy enough that I fell back asleep. In the morning, I'd completely forgotten about it. That's until my brother-in-law said to us, "It's a good thing we put the dog in the car last night. There was a bear here," whilst we were sleeping. Dean pointed out the tree where we'd strung up our trash and saw the fresh, gaping claw marks about 9 feet deep up the trunk. That hit me hard. I had seen the bear and calmly watched it test the fabric of my tent 12 inches from my face. I went camping with the summer program when I was 16. 12 other guys being managed by 4 adult men, and we were having a great time. S'mores, hot cocoa, campfire stories, the works. We all had to be in our tents and either sleeping or awake, but quiet, by 11. I was in a tent with 2 other guys, staying up later and just talking typical teenage guy stuff. As one guy is talking, I start to hear heavy breathing nearby, like someone has just been running and is out of breath. I ignore it and keep listening. I figure I'm just a weird kid hearing things, or that one of the guys in the next tent is making the noise whilst he sleeps. Then we hear, "Please, help me," from outside. It didn't sound like anyone in the group. It sounded like an old man out of breath. We all went dead quiet and listened to this guy's breath, then asked again with a whimper at the end. I don't know what possessed this guy near the front of our tent, but he turned on a flashlight and opened the inner flap, but kept the outer zipped and looked out. We just see a pair of bare, old and scabbed pale legs standing there. It looked like this guy had been walking nude through the woods for some time. He asked for help and kept standing there. We were all paralyzed with fear, but the guy at the front managed to say, "Keep walking down the trail. A ranger will be there soon." The guy stopped breathing and said, No rangers. They keep me here." It was at this point someone else finally spoke up. A chaperone came out of his tent with a flashlight and cautiously asked him how long he'd been there and what happened to him. The old man didn't answer, just started sobbing and ran off into the woods. We saw by the flashlight that he was completely naked and emaciated. This was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when I was 20, and in a really bad way. I had been screwing up my life via heroin for the past year, but after a lot of help love and luck from friends and family. Finally, I was getting my head cleared and was almost there, above the black tar hell I had gotten myself into. I decided to get out of the city and drove 2 hours out to a smaller town in Missouri, where Google Maps told me a small campsite by water was. I knew that there shouldn't be very many campers because it had just gotten cold and was around 40 or so that night. Nearly there, as I'm driving down a misty morning road, just a picturesque straight two-line highway. There's this object laying in the road about half a mile up. I slow my approach and can see this shaggy mutt just hanging out. I stop and rolled down my window right next to it, and she came up, licked my hand and wagged her tail a bit. She seemed to expect something of me. She had no tag, no tattoo for Chip, and was just a dog with no name. Naturally, I popped open the passenger side door for her, and she was so glad and hopped in. So now I've got this dirty but friendly companion with me for my little excursion, the dog with no name. The entrance to the campsite was only a half-mile further. As I suspected, there was no one around. I just dropped a 5 in the honor box and picked the closest site to the stream. I set up my tent, the same one I did set up for years with my dad as a kid, collected some dry sticks, and started a fire. The dog with no name just circled the campsite, looking content enough to sniff some leaves and roll around in the mud. I went to check out the rivulet, about 30 feet wide. It had a man-made stone dam that you could walk across. To the west was the deeper part of the river, sort of pooling at the dam, then maybe an 8-foot drop to the east into calmer streams. Instantly, I wanted to go on, cleanse myself, symbolize, baptize, whatever. I grew up Catholic, so that kind of shit runs through my head to this day, though I'm far from religious. The dog sees me scoping out the whole time from the campsite. I can't bring myself to do it though. I'm hugely disappointed in myself. But it's cold, it's brackish, and I don't have a towel. So I go back up to smoke some cigarettes, eat hot dogs, and pet the dog with no name. Night falls quickly after all this meditation, and I roll inside the tent to sleep. My buddy sleeps inside the tent, next to the sleeping bag. This dog was awesome. And I wake up in the middle of the night for no reason. I can't put my finger on it. And my main source of warmth, the dog with no name, is missing. I slide out the tent, as I assume I left it unzipped, and there she is, just sitting there waiting for me in the pitch black, wagging her tail. I feel very strange, like something is happening here, and someone/something is telling me to get back down to the river and do the damn thing. We walk down the short trail together, surrounded by Missouri black. It's even colder than before, but I start to strip anyway, standing on the chilly stones of the dam. The dog with no name sits on the edge of the river again, just watching me, a slight wag. I'm now stark naked as can be, staring into this black pool that looks like supernatural ink. I should mention here that I hate swimming in the water. I can't see the bottom of it, and my fearful imagination takes over and I freak out. In other words, I stand naked on the dam for over 10 minutes before I finally mustered up the balls and just dive into the blackness. It was cold as hell and scary as shit. When I came up for air, I was thrashing wildly back towards the dam, scrambling back onto the slick stones. I shook out my hair and was surprised how the adrenaline helped me keep warm. As I was picking up my shoes and clothes, I looked over for my buddy at the river's edge. The dog with no name was nowhere in sight. Back up the campsite, I look around, gently whistling and that kind of thing. I'm more than woken up by now, So I go ahead and start another fire as dawn is just starting to break. I have another hot dog for breakfast and figure I might as well pack up and leave. This trip feels more than complete. I start my car up and check my phone. There is an hour time difference between the two. This happens to fall on daylight savings time. I'm not calling it a supernatural rip in time, but it's funny it was the night this went down. In fact, the exact time would have been around 3 or 4 a.m. the dog disappeared. So the dog never showed up again, and I never shot heroin again. Whilst prospecting out here in the Caribou region, I came across a set of rock piles, known as Chinese piles, out in the middle of nowhere. These being here means someone did a lot of digging back in the old days. So I started working, and after an hour and a half had about 10 grams of gold and was having a happy dance when I noticed the small standing stones on each of the rock walls. Each stone had several Chinese characters on them, and in a moment of dread, I realized that they were graves. I put the gold in a glass bottle I found nearby and left it behind. I also took down drawings of the symbols to show to a local historian, who later confirmed my suspicions that yes, they were graves, and they likely hadn't been seen in over 150 years. Chinese miners believe that if a miner died on site, the ground became cursed by the fallen miner's spirit, so they wouldn't continue to mine the area, and they would tell anyone who they met in the area that it had been worked out. Sometimes they would do extra work to make it look like the site was finished off, so people wouldn't end up digging up their comrades. I've been back several times, but I won't dig there out of respect. The site's super creepy in the morning fog. You can almost see people's outlines sitting around the piles. One of the stories my boss out here told me involved some sketchy folk from Prince George back in the 70s, and went with them looking for some mining gear to steal, so they could claim jump a site a few kilometers down the road. My boss went down this forgotten path into a clearing with 2 ancient bulldozers and a small cabin. The rest went to the bulldozers to see if they ran whilst my boss went into the cabin and was greeted by a skeleton, laying in bed with a bullet hole in his head. They brought in the cops, and they figured the guy had been there since 1935, since that was the last date on the papers inside. I went to the same cabin with him a few weeks back, but the place had been burnt down by quad bikers. So, as a kid I lived about 100 miles away from the nearest town, at a house without electricity or running water, which is the works in the Colorado Rockies. This place was in the absolute middle of nowhere, and we frequently sought all kinds of wild animals, ranging from elk, deer, coyotes, and cats. Our property and a bunch of other neighbors' properties bordered national forest roads, so to keep people off our road, we had to gate about 1.5 miles from our house that we drove through before we reached our house. This time of year, we are the only people up there, as all the other homes are hunting cabins, long empty by this time in late winter. Now, this was not the type of gate that you could drive around if you forgot your key. There were tons of trees all around it, with barbed wire, ditches and such, so anyone wanting for off-road around it would basically have to build a new road around this gate. Well, one night, my mother, brother and sister and I pull up to the gate, and we cannot find the key. It's gone. So one of us, i.e. me, has to walk all the way back up to the house in the pitch black to fetch the spare key and make their way back down. Now, it's recently snowed in January, and it is totally dark. You can't even see your hands in front of you dark, and with the new snow, You can't hear anything either. There are a few clouds in the sky, on and off to let some starlight through every once in a while. But it's dark, and of course there isn't a flashlight either. So off I go. First you walk through around 200 meters of trees. Then it opens up to a huge meadow, which then narrows back down again to trees for another 200 meters, and then opens up again into another huge meadow, which on the other side of is our house. I set out and everything seems fine. I'm just irritated that I have to do this. I'm about 15 years old at the time and a little angsty teen that is peeved off at the slightest chore. I was not thinking about my surroundings in the slightest, but as I'm walking, I get that feeling that I'm being watched as I'm halfway through the first meadow. That deep, creepy dread that something is right behind you and you can't see what it is made it 1,000 times worse by the lack of light and lack of being able to hear. My first instinct was to run, but I knew that if there was something, I was just going to provoke it. So I kept going, and then stopped to try and listen, as I heard a crunch echoing my footsteps. Holy shit. This time I walked a little faster, and I knew there was something behind me. It was probably a cat as well, so I just kept walking right into the second bunch of trees before it opened up into a meadow. I could see our house. I could feel the pressure. At this point we were predator and prey, and I could feel the breath on my shoes. So second clearing comes up and I know what the plan is, and I am about to book it. Thankfully, I'm familiar with what to do, and I scream as loud as I can. As I do so, my dogs hear me and they run to chase whatever it is from behind me. They continue running past me and I book it into the house. When I get in, I grab the 12 gauge first and the keys second, then pick up the tractor keys and jump in. There was no way I was going to walk that again. As I'm driving back towards the gate, I see the dogs running back. At least they weren't hurt. That could have been extremely dangerous. I also see the tracks. I knew it was a cat. It actually started approaching me from the first meadow and was tailing me for a long time. I tell my family the whole story, and I know that I'm not going to get any sleep tonight. From that day, I refused to be out alone at night in the countryside without a weapon. I was camping on land associated with the Anasazi, long-dead Pueblo Indians that very few people know anything about. This was when I was a Boy Scout. We hiked for a few days and we saw black bears every day. It's normally a somewhat unusual sight and freaked out the adult leaders and caused us to religiously use anti-bear tactics like bear bags. Not totally related to the story, but it slowed us down, which led us to the events here. Anyway, we camped in a wood cabin at the bottom of a plateau, and the local rangers told us a bunch of spooky camp stories about the plateau and its relation to the long-dead Anasazi people. Even their real names is lost to history, as Anasazi is what the Navajo called them, meaning ancient enemies, or those who are not us. Another part of what they told us that stands out is that the Anasazi were obsessed with ravens, and possibly crows as well, and a lot of their superstition revolved around massive raven people, and people with raven heads, stuff like that. I completely forget all the other details at this point, as it was well over a decade ago. Anyway, my tent mate is a bit slow, and is also very allergic to peanuts. He ends up eating some of the pre-packaged food that contains a copious amount. That, combined with the ongoing poor planning, fear of bears, and sloppy leadership, causes the adults to decide to camp out on the plateau rather than keep going. On this scout ranch, You're only supposed to camp outside the designated areas and never on the particular plateau, just because of the geography and the environment. But forget the rules, because we do anyway. We set up camp, eat, lay the bear bag, and head off to sleep. That night, though, was the craziest thing. I could hear so much thunder, and so could my tent mate, but absolutely no rain, like insanely loud. My tent mate and I were terrified. It could have been heat lining, but it sounded impossibly close. We're terrified. He, the braver one of the two, actually goes out to check. As he opens the flap, I see the forest behind him. He comes back a few minutes later, and the thunder pretty much stops at the same time. He looks at me and goes to bed without saying anything at all. It's not unusual in itself. He could be pretty slow and non-social, and likely had mild autism in hindsight. But the next day, we wake up and a ton of things popped red flags. Firstly, our tent is facing an open field, which is very strange, because yesterday we both saw Forrest from when he left the tent to check. Second, no one else heard lightning that night, except for us, which was absolutely crazy as it was loud enough to wake everyone on Earth. Remember how my tent mate checked out the thunder as well? Well, he had no recollection of what he saw. He woke up confused, saying that the last thing that he remembered was just stepping outside. The good part though, the guy in the tent next door brought this up before we did. He also decided to get up and check it out, and he claims that when he stepped out of the tent, there were no trees anywhere. Just extremely long, tall pole objects, almost as if there were thousands of stilts. When he looked up, he also said that there was no lightning visible, but it was super bright, full moon on steroids bright. He also claimed that he had seen flying, winged, pitch black objects, bigger than cars, and they looked like they had wings on them, and that they were round. He dove back inside and doesn't remember going to sleep or the noise going away. Remember the giant raven myths? I did, and I was scared shitless. I wouldn't have believed him if I hadn't have seen the trees and heard the thunder for myself. About 10 years ago, I was working as a private investigator. It sounds cool, but it actually isn't. You spend about 3 to 5 hours each day driving to your cases. Stake them out in a blazing hot car with the engine off for 8 hours, and then spend 1 to 3 hours in a hotel room writing up your reports before finally getting some sleep and doing it all over again. I did this job for about a year after completing my training to be a medic in the Army Reserves. I was young at the time, so the idea of making $50,000 a year and traveling all over the country whilst living out of a suitcase seemed appealing to 19-year-old me. As I said before, you spend a lot of time driving around in areas you're not necessarily familiar with. On one of those late nights, I found myself driving onto a twisting mountain road just outside of Taos, New Mexico. The area was heavily wooded with narrow roads that curved sharply, without a lot of places to turn off, since you were driving up and around mountains and forests. In the middle of the night, as I maneuvered my rental vehicle through a curve, I saw a woman stumbling along the side of the road carrying a small child. The sight caught me off guard and sent a shiver down my spine. It was so unexpected and so out of place. There were no houses nor buildings around me, and it was around 2 a.m. and pitch black. This unnerved me, but what sent the shiver down my spine was the way she moved. She lurched along with what I can only describe as a shuffle, straight out of a George Romero zombie flick, and she didn't look up or acknowledge me as I drove by. She just stared aimlessly at the road in front of her. You have to remember that I was 19 years old, and fresh out of a year of extensive army training. I was in peak physical shape, and I thought I was Billy Badass at the time. I had spent a month working in trauma centers as part of my training, so I still don't often get freaked out or scared, but seeing this did scare me. I drove on for a minute or two thinking about what I'd just seen. Who was she? What was she doing here this time of night? How did she get here? The more rational part of my brain took over, and I came to a horrifying realization. I had been driving for about 1.5 miles past her, and I hadn't seen any homes nor businesses, nor had I come across any places to turn off since I had seen her. And it had been about 10 miles since I had come across a place to turn before I saw her. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. I realized that she had to be hurt or in trouble. Perhaps she'd been in a car accident and was in shock. What if the child she was carrying was hurt? I was a medic. I had trained for a year to help people. Sure, I was scared and unnerved. But how would I feel if they later died of exposure out on the mountain, and I was too much of a coward to go back and help? Wouldn't I also be scared the first time I saw combat, when my friends were depending on me? I had to man up and turn around. And as soon as it was safe, I did so. I drove back to where I'd seen her, half relieved and half horrified when I could not find her. I traced the road 6 times. Where could she have gone? There was only a small area on the side of the road and guardrails for miles. I drove, turned around and drove, and turned around and drove, and turned around and drove again. I was obsessed with finding her. Part of it was out of concern for her child. Part of it was proving myself that I was doing the right thing, even though I was scared shitless. After a while, however, it became about me proving it to myself that I wasn't actually going insane. I spent hours looking for her. Eventually, I stopped my car and started walking along the road, looking for any signs of her or any disturbance on the mountain to indicate that a vehicle had crashed off the road and down a mountain. I walked that entire 3-mile stretch of road in pitch black with a flashlight, at times yelling like a madman, listening to every twig and echo with bated breath. I didn't even care about my deadline or my next case. I was sure of what I saw. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't seeing things, and I wasn't overly tired. I saw her stumbling down that road, and there's no doubt in my mind. But there was nothing. Even when the sun came up and I drove to the stretch of road again 6 times, there was nothing. And there was no way for me to explain it, even after countless sleepless nights in the 10 years since devoted to it. I don't believe in ghosts. I saw this bullshit documentary and laugh away their evidence in stupid orbs like the rest of you do. But I also don't know where the hell the stumbling woman and her child came from, or where they went. So, on the off chance that you were stumbling down a winding road in Taos, New Mexico about 10 years ago with a toddler in your arms, please, tell me what happened, where you came from, where you went, and that you are both okay. I've been puzzled for a decade now. I used to regularly walk portions of the Appalachian Trail, and usually take a week or two by myself. Anyway, at one point I was coming over a pass and saw a figure on the trail ahead. Seems to be a lone young woman. It's twilight and the moon will be bright. I have solar rechargeable lamps, and I yell ahead, "Ahoy!" She doesn't break stride or pause. Being on the trail, people are friendly and cooperative. Looks like she's had a bad day, and no tent. Now sure, I like to sleep under the stars, and I usually hike with a hammock and a rainfly. but something seemed off. We were way out here. The last trail shelter was a few miles back, and we were on a very heavy bush cliff. Nowhere you want to camp for the night. I figure she might be wary of strangers at night, so I keep my own pace and don't really pay much more attention to her until she disappears over the next pass, and I realize she's walking this trail. Now dark, with some moonlight but heavy tree cover, without a torch, lamp or any personal light source. I'm getting worried about this girl. Remember, we are walking with a sheer cliff face a few yards away from us, and conditions aren't perfect. Roots, dirt, mud, moss, rocks, anything can trip you up. So I pick up pace and hurry over to the pass. She's nowhere, and there's a clear line of sight probably 200 yards ahead, and she's nowhere to be seen. But then I see a torch in the distance. Red lamp. Actually, there's two now that I'm getting closer. I flash my torch, and they flash theirs. I call ahoy, and a man and woman respond. We finally meet up and do the whole meet and greet, exchange trail names and chat for a bit about what's ahead in our paths, since we were walking opposite directions. I say to the girl, "You worried me back there. I saw you walking without a light and then you disappeared over the pass. I'm sorry I spooked you. Didn't think you were that far off though. Must have run like crazy to cover as much ground." She looked confused. "What are you talking about?" I explained everything, and she said that she hadn't seen anyone on the trail for at least 3 miles. There was no one reported missing, no abandoned campsites, nothing. I followed up with state police and rangers. Nothing. Who the hell was on the trail ahead of me? Walking at night with no light, minimal gear, and then to just suddenly disappear when there's only one way to go along the trail? I'm still clueless. I used to work security, and several years ago I was assigned to a remote construction site where a summer camp was being built. It was quite literally in the middle of the woods, roughly 4 or 5 miles into the forest, with only a single access road that they'd been using to haul equipment and supplies and such. My job was to provide overnight security, doing a foot patrol of the entire area. The patrol covered around 2 miles, roughly once every hour, and then going back to my post, which was a tiny wooden shack not much bigger than a payphone booth to fill out my logs. Other than the occasional black bear, coyote or bobcat, it was a very boring assignment, with one exception. I was doing a routine patrol one night near the end of my shift, around 3 AM or so. I just passed the gate, where the access road enters the site, when I heard an extremely loud, piercing scream that seemed to have come from a distance down the road. It sounded like a woman screaming in absolute terror, and at this point I need to clarify. I hear bobcats pretty often around my house, and encounter them occasionally whilst working in remote areas. They definitely have a distinctive and creepy scream, but there is absolutely no way that this scream was a bobcat. I immediately took off sprinting as fast as I could in that direction. I didn't hear anything else after the initial scream, but about a quarter of a mile down or so, I came upon a car parked just off the side of the road. There was no car in sight when I'd come through on my way to my shift, so I had to have been parked there fairly recently, not running and with no lights on, and no doors open nor anything. I called out to see if anyone was there, but got no reply. I looked around the general area and didn't see anything. Needless to say, I was pretty goddamn sketched out at this point. I ran back to my post and reported what I'd seen to the local police, since there wasn't really anything else I could do. Unfortunately, nothing ever came of it. I've never found out whose scream I heard or what caused it. The car was apparently owned by a guy who lived in the area, but I never heard why he was there. my supervisor suggested that maybe I'd heard a mountain lion or another animal screaming. But I've heard those animal sounds before, and although they're definitely freaky, there's no mistaking an honest-to-God human scream. A friend of mine and I were hiking through the woods. It was dark out, and we were beginning to head back towards home, when something came across the path by a fallen tree. It's hard to describe, but it looked like a man in a hooded cloak. It stood, and then slowly and silently moved to a tree and keeled. We couldn't see its face, but we got the feeling that we were being watched. We tried to shrug it off and keep moving. Further down the trail, we saw it again. Being in our early teens, we decided stupidly that we were going to get to the bottom of this. So we started after it, and it started charging. We screamed and it stopped, and then took off into the woods. Feeling brave again, I grabbed a big spear-shaped stick and took off after it. I ran for a bit through the woods until I could see the outline of it once more up ahead through the moonlight. I knelt and watched as another popped up beside it, then another, and then I heard moving to the side of me, realizing that whatever these things were, they had surrounded me. I quickly noped out of there in the direction I left my friend, so I know that sounds like the creepy part, but it gets weirder. My friend wasn't there when I'd left him. So I called out to him, and he responded a little away, followed by, "You've got to see this." So I followed his voice and came to a clearing. It was bright as hell, and floating around the clearing were legit balls of light, almost like the fairy fountains from The Legend of Zelda. These were pure white light, and we looked at each other, and then hightailed it back to the trail and went home. It was definitely the strangest and scariest thing I've ever witnessed. I grew up in a very rural area of the Deep South, and spent most of my time riding horses alone in national forests and expensive private properties that bordered our house. There was an old abandoned house 2 miles ride through the woods from me. I often rode by it on my journeys through the woods. Sometimes I tied my horse up, went inside and explored. But there was nothing really of interest. There was just trash, and things that looked like electricity bills from the 80s. I think an old woman used to live there based on some pictures that I found. Time went on, and I went away to college, taking my horse with me. I no longer rode past this abandoned house after graduating my college, and my horse and I moved back home for a little while, and I decided to go back to explore the area again. So I rode my horse the 2 miles through the deep woods to get to this house, which itself is probably 1,000 feet from a lonely gravel road that cuts through the forest. It is very secluded and almost creepy. The house is about 3 miles away from a paved road. I am less brave than I used to be, so when I entered the house I felt out of place and slightly scared. But I used my cell phone light to explore the rooms anyway. A lot was just as I remembered, but right as I was about to leave, I found half a skeletal calf in the corner of the entry room. I have no idea how the calf got shut inside a building. The doors were firmly shut when I approached it, and also the screen door opened one way, so it was impossible for both to be open at once for some creature to accidentally wander in. Furthermore, the nearest cow pastures were a good bit away from the house. I left the abandoned house with the image of my head of some deviant, cruelly trapping a calf in there for sick purposes. I hope I never have to meet the sickos who did that. It's felt like years. Allow me to explain. It was a vivid summer day, and I had taken a short notice trip to Arizona, trying to find some relief from the tiresome sunshine state on the other side of the nation. I only decided to leave when I was hit with a rather heavy day at work. My boss decided to chew me out for running late, despite the massive car crash on the motorway. A customer yelled at me because they didn't know what a Gmail was. Yeah, because I can definitely control traffic. And yeah, I definitely want to explain to you what Gmail is. I hate working customer service, so I called in sick and caught a last-minute flight to Phoenix. Phoenix. Yeah, Phoenix. Nice and far away from the hell I called home. I wish I'd never decided to do that. Around 2 days into my trip, I decided to head up to Zion Canyon for some sightseeing. I had spent a lot of time around the Grand Canyon and figured I should set some time apart to check out other places in the area. Besides, I'd never been to Utah before. Maybe I would take a hike, that one trail I had already read upon. Angel's Landing looked dangerous, but it would be something incredible to experience, and certainly worth it if I made the summit. I turned on Google Maps, and my rather shitty Android fumbled around with it until finally it picked up the location. The voice of a robotic woman began to speak. It was the damn GPS lady. She guided me through several backwater roads with twists and turns and roundabouts, until she stopped with a final sentence. Head on Highway 89. Continue straight for 184 miles. Alright, seemed easy enough. As I finally approached the highway, I was absolutely in awe by the view. No more buildings remained, only the wild, barren landscape of the southwest. Mountains peaked in the distance, covered by desert shrubs. Old trailers and abandoned houses dotted the landscape. Everything was so beautiful compared to the constant headache that was Florida. My eyes soaked up the desert views, relieved that for once it wasn't just endless miles of swampland. I felt so isolated. I was free from civilization for miles. But something was wrong. The desert didn't feel real to me. The sun was too bright, the mountains too still, and the sky too blue. The whole landscape seemed too picturesque, as if it were straight out of a postcard. It felt as though it were all a facade to drag me into something, and it was not unlike something straight out of a fever dream. You know those mornings as a kid when you wake up with a pounding headache and sense of false reality? I'd been driving for hours, and the scenery just seemed to remain stagnant. I was so sure I'd spent the entire damn day on the road, but the sun hadn't moved an inch. Was I hallucinating? God, when was this road ever going to end? Speaking of it, I'm still here. I've been driving on this road every day. It only keeps on going and going. I've been seeing the same road signs over and over. There's no civilization around. I've tried knocking on those trailer doors, but no one's ever home. And you know what else? Despite my solitude, I feel like I'm constantly being chased. I hate that feeling. That same feeling from when you're a kid and you sprint up the stairs from the pinch of darkness down, not daring to look back at whatever was behind you. That feeling when any source of noise of your house was enough to make you jump and run for your life. The source of the noise for me was the booming. And that feeling is always here. Every once in a while I hear a booming, as if someone is going at it with a gigantic drum. I slow my car down, and the booming gets faster, closer and louder. And that feeling, every time I slow, the feeling grows stronger, as if whatever it was is getting closer. It's like whatever that something is hunting me down, almost testing me, and every time I stop, the booming gets louder, as if it's targeting me. I don't know what that is, but I feel like it's dangerous. I don't know what chases behind me, but I know better than the kid who runs away from his basement door the first chance he gets. Running away from that something, but that something is behind me. I don't know what it is, but it's got me trapped right where it wants me to be, and I can't get out. I've driven off cliffs and into rivers, yet I wake up on the side of the road again, to the same site, my truck waiting for me to drive off again. I can't even commit suicide. The place won't let me. I've tried communicating through whatever internet I could scrounge up on my phone, but I don't even know if anyone has seen my cries for help. The screen just shows up blank, save for my own words written in desperation. No one will ever answer my texts. No one will answer my calls. I will never see any other cars. Only me. I never get hungry, or tired, or thirsty. Only trapped. It's like time hasn't passed. Time hasn't passed. Everyone is gone. Something's chasing me, and I'm still writing this. I think I've been in the same spot for too long. The boom's only getting louder, and now something is right behind me. Time has not passed, and I need to get out. Now. Tonight, my sister, brother-in-law and 2 friends and I all piled into a truck and we headed out to the desert near the old Cal Portland concrete factory. About half hour into driving, kicking up dust and messing around, everyone gets the chills, and my anxiety starts to flare up. We brush it off as the temperature difference and just keep going. 10 minutes later, we come around a corner and my sister says, "Please tell me you guys just saw that woman." We responded with, "What woman?" She says, "We just passed a woman standing on the side of the road wearing pink. I think it was a pink shirt, and she had blonde hair that was covering her face. She looked dead." I honestly thought she was messing with me. So we turn around and go to the spot where she saw her. No woman. Brother-in-law and I get our flashlights out and look around. No woman. I tell my sister she's seeing things, and she insists that she saw a woman. So I decide to check my dashcam footage. Sure as shit, there was a woman. She was crossing the road, it looks like, and she just vanishes into thin air. My camera isn't of the best quality by any means, and it was quite dark, but it's clear what we saw. My brother-in-law and I canvassed a 2-mile square radius with flashlights calling out to the woman because we legitimately thought that someone was lost out in the desert. The entire time we kept feeling and hearing things around us. Some info to note, this was right next to an extremely murky pond. There is a possibility that her body could be hidden in the pond. A couple of years ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in the Pacific Northwest between San Francisco and Portland. We had rented a car and were stopping at different campsites every night on our way from the former to the latter. The first night we arrive at a campsite, we find that it had been closed for the season, despite the fact that we looked on their website and they say that they were open. So we ended up driving around, looking for another campsite on Google Maps. But at this point, it's getting dark. We see a forest firefighter outpost and pull in to ask them if they know of any nearby. They tell us that most of them are closed for the season, but there are a couple on their old map that we haven't checked. We get back on the road and find our way to one of these campsites. The sign for this place is literally resting on the ground and is a little overgrown. But at this point it's dark as hell, and we really don't have many other options. As we pull our car into what we think is a spot, we see a few other tents nearby, so we take it as a good sign. We get out and start to set up our things, when immediately, things begin to get strange. Two guys walk directly through our spot and strike up a conversation with us. Both are looking a little rough. One of them has a zip-up hoodie without a shirt underneath, and I notice that he is extremely skinny. They're also both really dirty and have messed up hair, but hey, we're camping. They're both speaking very fast and seem kind of nervous. They tell us that they're actually seasonal workers nearby and are staying at this campsite to save money whilst they're there. Whilst we're talking to these two guys, a decade-old white Mercedes pulls into the campsite with all four windows blasting rap music. The driver and passenger look like some real ICP enthusiasts. They look around quickly and leave immediately. At the time, I thought they were probably looking for a campsite too. The two rough dudes also leave, and we continue setting up camp. Not too long after, we get another visitor. This time it's an older woman, with a 3-pack-a-day voice. She's nice enough, but also asking us some pretty weird questions. "You guys here for the horror show?" she asks. I'm thinking, what's a horror show? "Do you mean the haunted house, lady?" She tells us that lots of people come out for the horror show and starts warning us about all the ghouls and zombies. She eventually leaves, and my girlfriend and I agree they must be talking about some kind of haunted house nearby, as it was early October. And you know, maybe that's where the seasonal worker dudes who looked kind of scary happened to be working at. It all checked out in my mind. We start our fire, and I begin breaking out the wood, when my girlfriend admits that she's freaked out. She's worried about the people that we've encountered and how strange this campsite is. She points out that there aren't really any sounds coming from anyone else's tents, with the exception of the one woman, who wouldn't stop coughing. No music, no children, laughter, nothing. I'm starting to believe her. But at this point it's pretty late, and we don't really have any other options. I'm also thinking that if the campsite is weird, it's just some harmless weirdos. She seems pacified by my confidence, and we continue making dinner. It's at this point a bunch of really weird shit starts happening. The two dudes we met right when we got there emerge from the woods without any source of light and without saying a word, walking straight into their tent. They have a very short and heated discussion which I can't make out. One of them storms out of the tent and walks straight towards the older woman's campsite, making eye contact with me for an uncomfortably long amount of time. He then climbs into the cab of her pickup truck, and I realize there's already someone in there, and likely has been for some time. Probably the woman. You can tell that they start smoking something from when the lighter flickers. This strikes me as especially odd. You smoke cigarettes in the car? Probably not. Pot? We're at a campsite in Northern California, and I'm pretty sure there aren't any kids around. Why go into the car to do that? Then it hits me like a sack of bricks. It's meth. They were all smoking meth, and the woman was probably dealing. The level of comfort she had established in her campsite indicated that she'd been there for a while. Meth explained why everyone was looking like emancipated zombies. It explained the juggalos driving through, getting spooked, and leaving. It explained the strange erratic behavior and constant coughing from everyone. This was clearly some sort of live-in meth village at a closed-down campsite, in the backwoods of Northern California. It's at this moment that I realize the second guy is skulking around the edge of our campsite, clearly trying not to be seen. I conceded to my girlfriend that I also wanted to leave. We packed up everything very slowly and normally, trying to make it look like we were just putting away food and putting our fire out for the night. With only the tent left, I tell my girlfriend to get into the car and get ready to back out of the spot. The second I pick up the tent, the woman's truck starts up and her lights turn on. They were blindingly bright circular lights on a rack. I throw the tent into the trunk as fast as I can and I tell my girlfriend to back up. I'm standing behind the car to guide her, but also making it very clear to whoever's watching us that I have a hatchet. I was so on edge that if Mr. Rogers caught me off guard, I would have buried that thing into his skull. She throws the car into reverse, hits the pedal, and the car doesn't move. I can hear the engine revving, and I see the car lurching, but it's not going anywhere. For a split second, I think they've slashed our tires somehow. This is how horror movies start. Suddenly it hits me. The parking brake is likely on. It was. She backs up, gets on the main path, and I jump in the passenger seat. As we drive out there, we can hear them start screaming about something. Once we get onto the main road, we do a Chinese fire drill. And I drive down the road at warp speed to the first bed and breakfast that we see. It was lovely. It was June 1987, because it was the baseball season after the Bill Buckner disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place. It was in southeast Idaho. It was a pretty big place with lots of acreage. The guy who was the full-time caretaker for the place had just quit, and my girlfriend's dad went out there to find a new caretaker. But the new caretaker couldn't start for 1 month. Her dad offered to pay me $1,200 to go out there. Free food, satellite TV, and all I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. I had never been out west, so I took him up on it, and it sounded better than doing landscaping. I spent the time reading, exploring, playing the dogs and riding the horse. It was completely uneventful, until that night. After the knocking stopped and dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out that much because there were 2 German Shepherds inside with me, and I had a gun. I kept it on my nightstand. I had been drinking a little but was not drunk by any means. There were several neighbors that were a few miles away. I was kind of thinking that someone had just driven down the wrong driveway. Next morning at the crack of dawn, I opened the front door to let the dogs out and see a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was around 100 yards from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anyone with that make or model of car. He said he didn't, and he called the police directly. Police show up, ask me a few questions, and walk around the property for an hour or so. The car was locked, and the police had it towed. I have no idea if it was broken down or not. There was only 1 set of tire tracks coming into the house. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up to say the guy who owned the car was missing, and to call the police if anything weird happened again. I have no idea who the guy was at all. Don't know how long he was missing or when he was reported missing, or who reported him missing. He was just missing. My girlfriend's dad didn't know much about it either. After about a month, I go back home. The girlfriend and I break up shortly thereafter. I see her out of town a few months later and ask her if she ever found out what happened to the guy. All she knows is that the guy was found dead, apparently killed himself 30 miles away. The suicide happened several months after that incident at the house, and he was found a couple of days after that he'd killed himself. I asked her how he did it, where he was found and who found him, and I got nothing. And I never saw her again. I am an extremely outdoorsy female and love to spend a lot of time in nature. I spent the better part of my early 20s living in the remote northern locations and exploring a lot of Alaska, Yukon, and BC. I have many odd, frightening, and bizarre stories that came from my time in the north, and this is one of them. In the summer of 2012, when I was 22, I was living and working in a pretty remote town in northern British Columbia from May to September. The place I worked at was a campground in a provincial park on the Alaskan Highway, 4 hours north of Fort Nelson and 2 hours south of the Yukon/British Columbia border. The best part about the park was the fact that it had a beautiful natural hot springs, which attracted tourists from all over North America every summer. I lived in an old trailer on a separate part of the campground, where the rest of the staff lived. I quickly got used to living in a place that had no running water, no electricity, no cell phone service, and no internet. And driving 4 hours to Fort Nelson every 2 weeks to get groceries and do my laundry, life was pretty sweet. I got to hike, go for late night dips in the springs, and make some traveling friends, and spend quality time in nature, getting to know the flora and fauna of the landscape. My job at the campground? Park facility operator, which was general maintenance and cleaning of campsites, as well as gatehouse attendant, wildlife interpreter, and sometimes I had a few security shifts here and there. The feeling of living in the woods was so completely different than the feeling of living in a city, as far as safety goes. In the city that I'm from, there are people around, and you are aware of the fact that your house or apartment could get broken into, but emergency services are pretty quick to respond, and neighbors are also a big plus. However, in the woods, I felt very vulnerable. The closest police were 4 hours away, and I lived in a trailer that was run down enough that it could easily be broken into. Not to mention it was pretty dark, which made it all the easier to sneak around at night. I was already on edge sleeping every night. The trailer next to mine was abandoned by the previous manager of the campground, after his son had shot himself in the head inside of it. The previous manager had promised numerous times he would hire a company to drive up from Fort Nelson and tow the trailer away, but that never happened. Not whilst I lived there, at least, and nobody seemed to care about it too much. I went into the trailer once, saw the blood and brains were still on the wall, and never went back again. Back in the 90s, there was also a fatal bear attack at the hot springs. We all had to read the incredibly gruesome and detailed police report for our bear aware training. So yeah, unsettling to say the least. One night, at probably around 2 in the morning, I'm asleep inside my trailer and am woken up by a very loud banging on the trailer door. Reasonably shaken, I look outside the window next to my bed, and I see a car with its lights on and 2 men standing at my door. I can feel the blood drain from my face. This is the moment I've been scared of the entire summer. Through the door I say, "How can I help you?" And one of the guys, clearly hammered out of his mind, starts rambling on about something. No matter how hard I try, I cannot understand what he is saying. I say, "Sorry, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." and the other guy starts frantically trying to explain something in the same drunken state as the first guy. I decide at this point that they don't mean any harm, and I open the door to speak to them. They look visibly shaken, and I can tell that they are desperate for my help, but don't have the mental capacity of a sober person enough to coherently tell me what is wrong. One of the dudes starts telling me a very long story that I managed to piece together through all of his slurring and hiccuping. Basically, he says that him and his friend are on vacation, and they came up from Fort Nelson to party. They had a really long drive, but were at the hot springs and they were having beers. And they were sorry about having beers. They weren't drunk, clearly. And then he drops the bomb that someone is running around the camp, stabbing people. I look at the guy telling me the story, and I notice that he has blood all over his clothing. I say, "Someone is going around stabbing people?" And he replies, "Yes, someone's running around stabbing everyone." Then the other guy yells, "Come on, let's go." And they hop into the aforementioned car and sped off, before I got a chance to question them further. Now I'm standing at my trailer door, in the darkness, alone, thinking that there's a maniac running outside wielding a knife. I have no phone, and I know that the only person who has a phone is the ranger, and his cabin is about a 5-minute walk away from my trailer. I remember at that point that I do have a radio, so I run inside my trailer, lock the door, and try and get the ranger on the radio. Of course, his radio is switched off, and the only thing I think I can do at this point is to go to the ranger's cabin and notify him of the situation. I slip out of my trailer and run through the darkness across the maintenance ground, past the creepy suicide trailer, and through a thicket straight towards the ranger's cabin. Every single noise I hear from the surrounding forest is making my heart pound faster. I keep imagining this maniacal man sneaking through the bushes, entering people's tents, and slashing everybody like some bad horror film. I get to the ranger's cabin and pound on his door. He answers within a few minutes, visibly sleep deprived, and I tell him the whole story. Whilst I'm there, he calls the police, and he tells him that they are on their way and will be there in 4 hours. The ranger grabs his gun, walks me to the back of the trailer and says, "Don't let anybody in." I stay up the rest of the night, listening for any sort of disturbance around me. The intense kind of listening, where you're concentrating so hard on any external sounds that might be made, that you almost feel death from the silence. After about 2 hours of doing this, my trailer starts rocking back and forth. I freeze. My heart drops. I can hear the sound of someone breathing extremely heavily, and I'm thinking, this is it. The knife-wielding maniac is going to murder me, and this trailer is going to have to be another one which they will have to tow away. I'm just sitting there on my bed, in my trailer as it's rocking, waiting for the maniac to stop tormenting me and just break the window and stab me. I am listening intently to the heavy breathing, and that's when I hear a grunt, a very non-human sounding grunt. I get a feeling that it's not what I think it is, and I peer out of the window, and I see a bison is scratching its back on the side of my trailer, causing it to rock back and forth. The RCMP get there around 6:30 a.m. and proceed with their investigation for about 10 hours. They close off the springs and the entire campground turns into an episode of CSI. We don't hear anything about what took place during the night until the investigation is over. Apparently, there was a guy at the Springs who made a lewd comment about one of the females in another group, which resulted in an argument. The guy disappeared and returned an hour later with a knife, stabbed 2 of the guys in the group, and booked it back to Fort Nelson. Not before stopping at my trailer with his buddy to tell me, of course, of the incident. Yeah, one of the guys at my trailer. He was the dude stabbing people. My guess is that him and his friends stopped by my trailer to try and make it look like they were innocent. Drunken logic. The 2 guys that were stabbed survived, which is good. For many days following this incident, I was cleaning up blood-soaked clothing and rags from all random places over the campground. So, knife-wielding maniac, let's not meet again. From 2012 to 2013, I did a lot of hiking in and around the coastal range of Oregon. I would frequently go out by myself for days, and coming to town to restock on food if necessary. It was commonplace for when I was in town to spend the whole day hiking back the 4 hours to where I was camping at dusk. The trail I took wasn't well traveled and looked more like a deer path than anything. I had chosen my campsite for its lack of foot traffic and its serenity avoiding conventional locations. I only had a cell phone on me during this period of hiking and camping, no bright clothing, and no GPS nor tracking device or emergency beacon, which probably wasn't the smartest idea looking back. There were times I heard and saw things whilst out in the forest that I didn't recognize by sight and or sound, but nothing came close to the incident that I had in May 2013. I had just done my usual restock in this small town some 6 miles from where I had decided to camp for the night, and I spent the day in town as usual. I started walking back to my camp location at about dusk. Half of the walk, I choose to use dirt roads, until veering off on the deer trails that I used earlier in the day. By this time, it was completely dark, but it was clear out and possible to see the trail just using the moonlight. I don't listen to headphones whilst hiking. I've always thought it's wise to be able to hear what's around you in the event of there being a predator, whether that be man or animal alike. I was mentally doing some calculations for the next day's hike when my mind is literally stopped mid-track. I hadn't heard anything, and I don't hardly make any sound when hiking. If I'd heard something, I would have known. For some reason, be it a sixth sense or survival instinct, I'm not sure, but I was jolted quite suddenly out of thought and made very aware of the fact that I wasn't alone on this trail. What was odd to me, especially, is that even though I had heard nothing whatsoever, no light wind, no birds, I knew acutely that something was behind me about 30 yards down the trail. I still to this day have so many unanswered questions about how I knew this. Standing really still, I turn around and look down, but I don't see anything in the trail. But I feel it. It's honestly really difficult to pin down exactly how to describe what I felt, because I hadn't felt that way before or since. I was standing straight up, fight or flight, and my logical mind was saying that there's nothing out of the ordinary, whilst my senses were saying to get the hell out of there. Again, looking back, and remembering I have no idea what to say. It's really hard to express. It was like I was being taunted, and I felt it. The presence of something or someone was down there in that trail, and for some reason, I knew that it knew that I knew it was there, even though I couldn't see it. That's what scares me. I knew, and it was bright enough out for me to see 30 yards down the trail with no problem. There was nothing there, and I felt as if I were being called or beckoned to come closer. This was maybe 30 seconds into looking down the trail. I was panicking, but I still wasn't sure what to think, because I wasn't seeing anything threatening. So I turned around and started walking at a quick pace. I don't know what else to do. I knew that if it was in fact a guy out to kill someone, he was probably going to end up killing me on this trail, or in my tent after following me back. So why run? I would say it was not even a minute into the quick trek back that I heard what can only be described as a sound like rushing or swooping air, and then what seemed like a rake sliding across the dirt trail. The former sound happened right after the latter. These sounds happened together at about half a second apart for 4 times. They were very close to me, maybe 20 yards back, and looking back, I don't know how I was able to stay composed and not soil myself, but somehow I mentally stayed focused enough on getting myself back to my tent. I ignored the panic and just kept walking quickly, not looking back. Whoever or whatever it was that followed me, the majority of the next hour, I kept heading forwards and didn't look back. A few minutes from my camp location, the fight or flight instinct gradually but succinctly left, and I crawled into my tent and didn't sleep a minute that entire night. Morning came, and I picked up and left. I grew up on the countryside, right next to a national park, frequently visited by nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. It was the kind of park where you're not really allowed to bike or ride horses, only walk or run. But 10-year-old me felt that this was a stupid rule, and so I did anyway, because the trails were perfect for it. I knew fully well that I wasn't supposed to do that, and was caught a few times, but nothing much came of it, apart from a half-hearted, "Don't do it again." And of course I did. Until one day, something frightening happened that made me stop. My family were horse breeders, and I would often take them on horse rides, usually into the Forbidden Park. This day, very early in the morning, the first day of summer holiday, it was beautiful outdoors, misty and foggy, yet a sky that promised a sunny day ahead. Since it was so early, before 6 a.m., I knew that there wouldn't be anyone on the trail to see me. So I set the horse off at full speed along the trail. I only slowed down on the part of the trail that got steep on one side, leading down to the river, because the thought of one step too close to the edge was too much even for a kid with next to no non-existent risk assessment skills. Suddenly the horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. I grew up with horses all my life and knew that this usually indicates that you need to investigate. Is there something with the hooves? Did the horse spot something that spooked it? So I checked and the hooves were fine, but the horse didn't move an inch. And that's when I saw it. Someone had set a trap. A thin, sharp metal wire across the trail, in perfect neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around, but didn't see anyone. The wire was well attached to 2 trees and impossible for me to remove, so I led the horse around it. And, to do so, I had to walk up a bit into the wooded area on the side of the trail. That's when I heard the singing. The song is called Hey Tomte Gubar, and it was that particular melody, but the lyrics were different and sung in a muffled, sniggering voice. Imagine Smeagol from Lord of the Rings. Today I only remember parts of it, but translated it would have been something like, "Hey, all you runners come here passing, let the lifeblood pour out. I, as silently as I could and with my heart in my throat, backed away and got up on the horse and hurried back the way I came as fast as I could. I knew I had to tell someone about it, but at the same time wanted to avoid admitting to riding a huge and very forbidden horse on those protected trails. So now I had a problem. The old stories about a mad old man living in the shed in the woods, a shed that was once a cottage for a local hunter, came back as I hung on the horse for dear life. I got home and told my older brother what had happened, and he went back there with me in tow. We found the wire trap, and after a while of searching, we also found a spear-like pole in the ground, right on the spot that you'd land after you came running and jumped over the fallen tree on the trail. That's when we called the police. The area was searched and several similar traps were found, but no sight of the old man. The following summer though, there was big news in the local paper about spear-like poles being found right under the water's surface, directly under the little tower you're supposed to dive from at the lake. And black garbage bags filled with big rocks were found on the narrow bridge crossing the river, so that if a car had hit it, there's a chance that it would have gone off the road and straight into the water. When I was about 10, me and my friend were walking on a road near the river when we spotted a tipped-over canoe. Having been in the fairly shallow river many times before, I didn't think twice about stepping in to push the canoe up and out. But just as I leveraged, the ground seemed to disappear. I was sucked down into a pit and tumbled around like a rag doll, only to be spit back out maybe 20 feet downstream and sucked under again. This happened over and over as my friend was running alongside trying to get a hold of me. Luckily, I was being shot to the surface often enough to get a little air before going under. He eventually reached me with a branch and I was able to get out. We didn't make a second attempt on the canoe and didn't tell anyone about the experience for fear of getting in trouble. But a couple of days later, we learned that an elderly couple had just drowned upstream. Their canoe tipped over and the undertow took care of the rest. I was nearly killed trying to get the same canoe that had just killed 2 people. I was about 13 years old, walking through a small section of pines back to my grandmother's house. It was a really dark and cloudy day, and was walking under the trees as it was very dim. As I walked, I saw a kid sitting underneath a tree ahead. This was a relatively rural outskirts of a small town, and there were only a few kids that lived around. I walked up to him to see who it was, as I didn't think I recognized him, so I stepped closer. It was a young boy, head down, gaunt and skinny. He was wearing burlap or wool pants, a ragged dress shirt, both very dirty and dingy. He had what looked like 2 little tin can wagons or cars, and was pushing them around in the dirt. As I got closer, almost right in front of him, a feeling of absolute dread and sickness washed over me, and all of a sudden, I felt like I was going to throw up. "Hey," I kind of stuttered. He looked straight up at me, and I froze like a stone, ice cold. In one quick move, he grabbed up his wagons and jumped to his feet, and circled around the back of the tree. It was quiet. I felt fine all of a sudden. I walked up to the tree, and he was gone. When I hiked alone frequently, I used to see flashes of color out of the corner of my eyes. It happened often enough that I learnt to pretty much ignore them. I dismissed most of them as birds, small animals, or my imagination. The ones that still caught my attention were the red or blue ones, and one time, pink. The bright colours were more hard to rationalise away. Carbon Glacier in Mount Rainier National Park, June 5th, 2001. I remember crossing the suspension bridge on my way to the Carbon Glacier, and it looked to be in very poor condition and was missing a couple of boards, forcing you to take a large step. The second missing board was right in the centre of the bridge, where you're furthest from the ground. My sister crossed first, and stopped about 3/4 of the way across. She turned around slowly, looked back at me, and yelled for me to step on 2 slats at a time, as one just broke under her foot. I froze at the second missing board, and it took me several seconds to take that long step across the hole. We decided to use the lower crossing to avoid the suspension bridge after. These days, it was the only way to go since the trail on the other side of the river washed out. We were having a good day talking and laughing and telling stories. My sister was in the middle of a story when a flash of white went past my peripheral vision on the left. I ignored it, but what I couldn't ignore was the fact that my sister had stopped talking. I turned to ask her what was wrong, and she was pale. She said someone was walking up the trail and just disappeared as they approached me. She was visibly shaken and upset. I chose not to tell her about the flash of white, as I had seen it at the same time. We were both teary and shaking and hiked out pretty quickly and very quietly. It took me several years before I spoke about it again. When I told my sister about the white flash, she couldn't remember any of it, as she completely blocked out that day. 2 years later, in an effort to see the standing file account at Washington State, I was given permission from the Highline School District to hike on their property to the old Stampede Pass lookout, now at Camp Woskowitz in North Bend. The woman at the office told me that I should hike around the property after visiting the lookout. It was a beautiful sunny winter day. I hiked to the lookout and then started down a different trail. The trail was fairly open, with a lot of salal. I heard a little girl laughing off in the distance, and assumed that someone else was enjoying the trails like me. Not a moment later, there was a flash of pink. I'd never seen pink before, and it gave me quite a fright. I looked into the woods and saw nothing. My stomach turned and my eyes teared up. I decided I'd had enough of Camp Woskowitz, and quickly headed back to my car. I was babysitting in a very remote house in the middle of nowhere, up in the mountains on the coast. I remember it was around 9 p.m, and the kids' parents would be getting home in about an hour. I had put the kids to bed, so was downstairs by myself watching TV. However, every so often the TV would flicker to static, and to be honest, it was starting to scare the shit out of me. It wasn't until the point where I looked up from the TV and out the nearby window when I lost my shit. There wasn't anything actually outside, but it seemed as if I saw in the reflection what looked like a Tin Man standing not too far behind me from the couch. Needless to say, there wasn't actually anything there when I snapped my head back to see where it was in the reflection. I grabbed my shit and wanted to be out of that house as quickly as possible. I actually ran upstairs and sat down quietly where the kids were sleeping until the parents got home. I particularly remember that when the parents arrived, I said I had to leave, and I was pulling out of their driveway in my old shitty Ford Laser, and looked up into the kids' bedroom. The same reflection I saw earlier was looking back down at me, with a hand raised as if it was saying goodbye. I never babysat there again. At my grandparents' on vacation to Iowa. They live in the middle of nowhere. Couple elderly neighbors and cornfields for miles. It was around 2 a.m. and I was going to go have a smoke before bed. Their back porch has a big sliding door. Well, I walk into the room with the sliding door, and there's a guy in a creepy mask. He's quietly wiggling the door trying to open it. I got so scared, I felt my butthole clench up, and I dropped my cigarette. Right then, the guy freezes and looks right at me. He pauses, then starts frantically shaking the door trying to open it, like this dude was trying to rip the door off the house. I run over to my grandparents' gun cabinet and grab something. By the time I whipped around to point it at him, he was gone. I ran and woke up my grandparents. We all walked around the house with loaded guns for a minute, but the guy was gone. A couple of weeks later, some bald guy walked out of a cornfield wearing a dress. He stood by the highway for half an hour, then got picked up by some sketchy car. I won't even go into cornfields in broad daylight anymore. This happened when I was 10. There were 5 or 6 of us spending the night at Charlie's house. Her parents owned a ranch in hill country region of Texas, and their home was built on top of a hill. Other than the dirt driveway up to their house, the hill was wild land covered in cedar trees. It was a clear, slightly chilly night in maybe October or November. But after the sun went down, the moon was out, so we stayed out playing hide and seek, using the driveway as a base. Their ranch was far enough out of town and well fenced, so her parents didn't have a problem with it. Anyway, during one round of hide and seek, me and my friend Georgina were the last 2 hidden. We were very good at hiding and avoiding the seekers, and they managed to find everyone else. Or so we thought. We almost made it back to the road, when 3 of the girls unknowingly cut us off, and we ducked behind a ridge of dirt to remain concealed. Georgina threw a rock across the road behind them to divert their attention, and we were waiting for them to get far enough off the road to make a dramatic rush for the safety of base, when I heard what sounded like a rock getting dislodged and sliding down the hill behind us. I thought Georgina might have done it, so I didn't say anything, but she kind of looked at me and asked if I was okay. I was about to reply when we heard what sounded like one of our friends, Charlie, the ones whose house we were staying at, calling from away down the hill behind us. "Help me." We bolted upright and yelled for the others. They came running back to the road, and we told them what we had heard. No one had seen Charlie since we'd started that round of hide and seek. We took them to the spot where we were hidden, and from there we called Charlie's name. For a moment, all was quiet. Then, faintly, even further down the hill, we heard her say, "Help, I'm stuck." We panicked and ran up the driveway as fast as we could to get to Charlie's parents. When we burst through the kitchen door ready to yell for her mum and dad, she was there at the bar eating a popsicle. "I wondered how long it was going to take for you all to find me," she gloated. We all flipped out, in the only way 10-year-old girls can. Her parents heard us freaking out downstairs and came down to see what's going on. We told them what happened, and her father grabbed his shotgun, got into the truck, and went to drive around the ranch, making sure that there wasn't anyone on the property who wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't find anything. I've always wondered what we heard that night. We didn't talk about it much, but I know it remained in all our minds every time we stayed there past sundown. I live in a small town in rural Australia. I am a cyclist, and I coordinate sport events, marathons, and sell bike gear and whatnot. Around 6 a.m, I drove my bike up the mountains, and on the way, I passed a woman sitting by the side of the road. At first I thought she may have been a hitchhiker, but there were no hotels around and she had no bags. I stopped my car around 400 meters away from her, grabbed a bottle out of the car boot, and walked down to see what was going on. At that moment, I realized she's one of the most gorgeous women that I had ever seen. She was probably in her 20s, pale as hell, long wavy blonde hair to her hips, and one of those really German hourglass kind of figures, with these deep blue eyes. She was wearing one of those long summer dresses that beach kids seem to love, which was friggin' weird for the middle of the Australian bush. So I walk up to her like, oh my god, but I'm also thinking, what the hell? I hand her the bottle of water and ask her if she's lost or needs a lift back to town. She just stares at me, doesn't take the water, and doesn't blink. I think, oh shit, is she some kind of crazy? So I ask her if she ran away from somewhere, and she just says, no, and hadn't blinked yet. So I ask her if she's waiting for someone to come pick her up, and she says, no, again. I ask her where her house is, and she says, here. Keep in mind I am halfway up a mountain, and there are no houses here at all. So I was kind of starting to get creeped out by this lady. I walked back to my Jeep, and I was going to start driving back down the mountain and call the cops and get them to come pick up this lady. And she follows me. I was like, look, are you sure you don't want me to run you back to town? And she just says no again. So I'm all like, look, I don't feel comfortable leaving you here in the middle of nowhere. Please let me take you to the police station. And she just turns around and walks off into the bush, miles from anywhere. And I'm sitting there like, what the actual hell? And then I started to get really scared when the bug and bird noises started to come back. It made me realize I hadn't heard a single other sound whilst I was speaking to her. No magpies, no crickets, no early morning sounds at all. I hightailed it out of there and called the local coppers when I reached the bottom of the mountain. Basically, I said there's a woman up in the mountain who refused to get into my car, and then realized how stupid that sounded and hung up. Whoever you are, I hope that you're okay. I have had the fortune of traveling all across this great and wonderful nation. But I've seen something whilst camping that makes me reconsider mountain folk in Georgia. Now, I love my home state. I love exploring the vast amounts of wilderness we have here. I just happen to carry a gun at all times whilst exploring now. I didn't then. I went to the Blue Ridge Mountains with a friend to hike. A week without cell phones, we called it. Except we had his satellite phone, just in case of an emergency. We hike as far as we please, and fish, and we find water. Of course, we also have a GPS and a compass to ensure that we don't get lost. So we're on our next to last day of hiking back. We come across a small clearing in a valley that has a nice sized pond. We stop to set up camp and fish. As night falls and our fire is fading, with our bellies full of fish, wild onion, potatoes and wine, we lay down to sleep. And then I hear it. My friend is fast asleep, and the sound doesn't wake him. There's something outside, close by, but not distant enough. A moment of stupidity and adrenaline hits me as I grab our machete and exit the tent brandishing my lackluster weapon. The sound of that of a drum is being played with skill and expertise that only a child with the basic idea of rhythm can possess. Upon exiting the tent, I see a fire and a woman across the pond. She's not creating the drum sound. Instead, she has a black kettle hoisted above her fire, and she's stirring it. She turns her face to me, and I see that she must be as old as the mountains themselves. Her clothes are nothing but rags, yet she has an aura about her, one that is dark and filled with terrible wisdom and knowledge. Her ancient eyes meet mine, and I become paralyzed by fear. The drumming grows louder, and then stops suddenly, and she's gone. So's the fire, and any evidence that she even existed. I started our fire again, and did not sleep. Upon hiking out of the woods and back into our car, we decided to stay at a hotel in a small town nearby, since I was exhausted from staying awake. Of course, I had told my tale to my friend when he woke, and we packed quickly and moved as fast as our legs would carry us. We got to the hotel, which, thankfully, had a restaurant and bar. I told my tale to some locals, and the consensus was that I had met the mountain witch, whose land I was trespassing on, and we were only alive because I had stayed awake. They may have been jesting, but they seemed very serious. I now carry a firearm whenever I hike, mostly because it makes me feel safer, and whether you believe my tale or not makes no difference to me, dear listener. But there are dark and ancient things in this world. Stay safe. In the early 1980s, I was about 8 years old, and my father decided to take me to deer camp for the first time. We were in far northern Wisconsin, where deer camp is sort of like a religion experience, especially our deer camp. Anyway, when we got there, my dad leaned in about 3 inches from my face and gave me a thinly veiled threat that he called a piece of advice. That what was done at camp stays at camp, and especially not to tell my mother what I was about to witness. It was mostly just a bunch of middle-aged drunks in long johns telling dirty jokes and playing cards. But to my eyes, it was the best place on earth. The first morning, my dad wakes me up early to go hunting with his best friend, who had cancer and wasn't expecting to make it back for next year. We were way back in the woods in a standoff when an unseasonal thunderstorm rolls in and chased us back to the truck. On our way back to camp, my father slams on the brakes because he sees something in the middle of the road. It was raining so hard that we couldn't tell what it was from inside. So my dad went to take a look. A couple of minutes later, he climbs back into the truck and simply says, "She's dead." We raced for miles to the nearest phone to call the police. It turns out that she was heavily pregnant, had put her car in the ditch about 5 miles away, and had died from exposure when she became lost looking for help. My main memory of this, though, is bursting out crying on the way home, because I just knew I couldn't keep this big of a secret from my mother. My dad simply told me that there were exceptions to every rule, and this was definitely one of them. I was running on the trails at the Nathan Hale homestead, an 18th century farmhouse and property of a Revolutionary War hero. This was in Connecticut, which is only about a 10-minute drive away from my grandmother's lake house. I could not find a map of the trails anywhere online, and there didn't seem to be any signage at this place, just a bunch of random mountain bike trails in the woods. I was only going to run 4 miles, so I estimated that I would run for about 30 minutes, using my watch to keep myself on track. So I ran around the trails for a while, and nothing seemed too out of the ordinary. It was around 9 on a Monday morning, and the only sounds were the distant hums of Route 31, birds chirping, and the occasional squirrel or deer that scampered off whenever I came near. The trail seemed to wind around a lot. If not for my better than average directional skills, I could have easily gotten lost. About 20 minutes in, I saw something strange about 50 meters off. A finely polished and light-colored wooden coffin. I was a little weirded out, to say the least, and waited until I got closer for a better look. I rounded a corner where several old tree stumps blocked my view, only to find that the coffin had disappeared. Where it should have been, there was just a clump of ferns. Odd. I turned around shortly thereafter and made my way back to my car. I was maybe half a mile out when I heard a very distinctive knocking on a nearby tree. I was a little spooked, but chalked it up to be a woodpecker or something. However, not 30 seconds later, there it was, on a completely different tree ahead of me. Exactly the same rhythm. Tock, tock, to tock, tock. I picked up the pace. The trail widened a little, and I could see way ahead to the entrance to the parking lot where my car was. There it was again, on a tree seemingly right next to me. I truly started freaking out, and started to book it back to the lot. I was nearing the opening, when time seemed to slow down. All of a sudden, it felt like the temperature dropped about 20 degrees. The birds stopped singing, and my simple Timex watch started to malfunction, making all sorts of beeping noises, and the numbers glitching on the screen. The beat sounded impossibly loud this time, like it were hacked into every surrounding tree with an axe. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me as I anticipated hearing the rhythm again. I burst into the parking lot, and everything went back to normal. The temperature was back in the mid-70s, and birds were chirping away. I looked at my watch, only to discover that it had gone completely blank. I stood there and stared at it until it flashed 12 o'clock, Monday, 1:01, January 1st. My watch had completely reset itself. It had never done this before. I got into the car and started the engine. The clock on the radio read 12. That couldn't be right. It should have been around 9:30 or 9:45 at the latest. So I threw her in reverse and backed up to where I could clearly make out was the main road. However, as I was about to throw the car into drive as it sat there, I heard a sharp, rapping sound on the back window, like someone hitting it with their knuckles. It was the same beat. There was no one else in the parking lot when I finished my run. No cars, nothing. I didn't dare look back and hightailed it back to my grandmother's house. I have no idea what could have caused this series of events, and I still could not explain it to this day. I was geocaching once, and as I was wandering through the woods, I came across a small patch of trees that had Mr. Potato Head faces nailed to them. I was a 15-kilometer drive from civilization, and nowhere near a trail. As the cache was deep in the woods, I contacted the cache owner, and he swore that they weren't there when he put the cache together, and it was his private land, so nobody should have put them there. The other instance of weird was up when I was hitchhiking, and decided to set up camp off in the woods not far from the highway. I had a fire, ate, and set up my little tent, and fell asleep without problem. I woke up in the middle of the night due to some heavy breathing outside my tent. I listened for a bit, scared shitless, and then some movement, and the sound was gone. I woke up the next morning, and there was a photo of my family stuck with a nail to a tree right beside my tent, and fresh footprints in the dirt. Being the idiot that I am, I followed the path of the footprints, a kilometer or so back into the woods, where it ended at a road. Across the street was an abandoned house, and while checking out the house for anything useful, I found several other photos of people from the photo, individuals' headshots, and notes apologizing for not protecting them or being there for them. I got a feeling like I wasn't alone, and decided to make an exit. And as I came out of the house, there was a pickup truck in the road watching me leave. He offered me a ride back to the highway, and some food and drink, and told me all about the family that lived there, and how they had all died. Apparently, the father had an accident whilst driving, and struck an oncoming vehicle, with the mother and 2 kids inside it. He lived, but everybody else died. My brother James was part of the orienteering team in high school. For those of you who don't know, orienteering is where they get you to go to the middle of nowhere in teams of 2. They give you a map, a compass, and you must find your way back to each check-in station in order, and it's a race. So my brother and his partner set out and make it through the first few checkpoints, and they're feeling pretty solid. But they don't make it to the next one when they're supposed to. They double check the map, do some math, and figure out that they miscalculated some angle or another, and are now almost off the edge of the map. They recalculate and set off in a new direction. Keep in mind, the line was never intended to be part of the orienteering run. This is unexplored territory, and they came across what my brother said could only be described as a crater. A deep bowl in the forest devoid of trees. And at the center was an ambulance. They are in the woods, miles upon miles from any road, and there is an ambulance that looks like it's decades old sitting in a crater. So, being teenage boys, they decide to investigate it. My brother said that the forest was well on its way to reclaiming the vehicle, that it was rusted and covered in plant life. It looked out of date, like it was coming from the 40s or some bygone era. In the back, the gurney was still there, but bent in the middle, like something had smashed it. There were brown smears on the walls that could have been rust, or dirt, or shit or blood. They both got a horrible feeling from the place and took off out of there. My brother thinks he could probably find it again, but flat out refuses to. I am a hunter and mountaineer. It was a chilly December morning, and I hiked in pre-dawn. I'm talking about an hour and a half to go 3 miles off the beaten trail. I got to my nest, and about half an hour before sunrise, and started to settle in. The wind kicked up a fog, and the fog rolled in that was thicker than a bowl of oatmeal. Within a few minutes, my visibility was about 5 inches. I'm sitting tight, huddled up against the freezing wind, when I start to hear twigs snapping close to me. For no apparent reason, what is normally a rapturous sound, indicative of an imminently successful hunt, sent a frosty chill down my spine. I chambered around in my 30-30 as quietly as I could, and lay flat on my back, tucked against a fallen tree. The rustling was moving closer through the fog, but I couldn't see anything. The sun was starting to peek over the mountains to the east, and visibility was starting to increase. The rustling of twigs and leaves was sporadic, sometimes directly in front of me, sometimes behind or beside me. I remember laying the rifle across my chest, thinking to myself how silly it is to react like such a coward. I rationed with myself that bears and mountain lions are a rarity where I was, so I had likely stumbled into a herd of whitetails that had bedded down and decided to sit up. The rustling stopped immediately, as it was fully dawn by now. I was looking through the fog for the outline of my prey, which I had assured myself was literally around me. It wasn't. Seemingly nothing was. By now the fog had faded away, and it was apparent to me that I was alone in those woods. I hunted all that day, without seeing as much as a squirrel. Around 3 in the afternoon, after fighting the wind in an abnormally cold day, and not wanting to hike out by flashlight, I decided it was time to start back to the truck. Walking out of those woods was the most uneasy I had ever felt. Lawfully, once you make your way back to the trail, you're supposed to clear the chamber of your rifle, but not that day. What is normally a stroll through the woods, I undertook with the seriousness of an animal being stalked. I would walk, then stop and listen, and I never heard or saw anything during my retreat, but I could feel eyes on me. I was about 100 feet away from my truck when I rounded the last corner and saw, hanging at eye level from a tree by a noose, a stuffed bear in a blazed orange jacket. I am a giant, broad-shouldered outdoorsman, but that one shook me up something fierce. It was early 1984. My true friends and I went to the Wildwood campgrounds on Long Island with my family. It was a safer time back then, so we thought we'd explore the forest. We went up to the cliffs, looking down at the beach, and back into the woods, soon becoming bored, so we headed deeper in. The woods were dark, tangled and overgrown with weeds and brambles. It was obvious the area was not used or even explored often, as it was so dense, so we started heading back. We noticed something upon our return, a house in the middle of the forest, most windows broken with a sagging roof, old and out of place, with no road leading to it, and no power lines either. It had a mailbox at the front, as well as a brick chimney. We entered the small home, of only a few rooms on the ground level, and a gaping hole in the floor showed an exposed basement below. A rotting wooden table, surrounded by peeling wallpaper of roses that sat next to the kitchen. There was a collection of old things, and what I identified as a very small, white gas stove speckled with corrosion. The stairs up and down looked unsafe and rickety. Small animal feces was everywhere, and I don't remember any electrical sockets, lights, or anything of that nature. It must have been from the early 20s or 30s, and the forest had begun to grow around it. The whole place was creepy and smelt like egg or a struck match. But what made it really creepy was the hole in the floor. We could only see part of it, as the floor bowed, and we feared getting too close. We could see on the basement floor that there were hundreds of playing cards, but only red ones, hearts and diamonds. I'd guessed that they were all red. Everything else was really dark. They were poured up in a heaping pile. For why, or if anything was underneath them, we will never know, because it scared us for some reason. The dark hole lit only by that spot, making the white and red cards seemed brighter. They were clean. They were new. And we got the hell out of there. I live by a small river, and my friend and I always spoke about putting a boat on it one night and just letting the current take us downstream whilst we fished all night. Well, a few years ago, we finally did it. We loaded up the boat with our fishing poles and a case of beer and headed out around 10 p.m. We put the boat in up the river, and my friend's girlfriend drove the truck home. The trip was only about 4 miles in a straight line, but throw in the curves of the river, and it was doubling back on itself. The actual trip was more like 15 miles. We'd been told it'd take about 6 hours, so we got to the river around midnight and expected to be home before 7 a.m. The river was really low that night, but we didn't expect it to be an issue, so we shoved off. The first few hours passed pretty normally, and we caught a few fish, but we passed a cutoff, and the river current just slowed to a halt. Around 2 a.m., we hear this faint groaning noise off in the distance. We didn't think much of it at first, because we are both campers, and we're used to the forest noises. As we keep moving slowly down the river, the groaning noises keep happening, and it's getting louder. I can't even really accurately describe the noise itself. It was a very throaty, groan/moaning sound, with a short duration. I say it was like a zombie noise, but it was very distinct, and at times it sounded like a man groaning in pain. For the next half hour, the noise got louder, until it felt like it was literally just out of sight on land, and it was loud. So I mentioned the river was really low. Well, at this point in our trip, the river walls were nearly vertical and 10 feet high. The sound is at its loudest right now, but as we go down the river, it doesn't get any quieter. We aren't moving past the groaning. It's following us in the darkness of the forest. We're both getting weirded out about it, and we're both assholes, and we're amplifying the situation by coming up with all kinds of scary things that it could be. It's a zombie, or a dying man trying to yell for help, a banshee, a ghost, or could it be a serial killer messing with us? Maybe it's a siren trying to lure us off course. As it nears 3 a.m., we're way behind schedule. To say I'm on edge is an understatement. I was trying to play it cool because my friend was playing it cool, and I didn't want him thinking that I'm a pussy. We're shining our flashlights into the forest, and we're watching as things scurry off in the darkness as the light hits it. The groaning is still going on. The loud groaning happens about once a minute, and something there is a quieter, slightly different sound that happens in between. The sound is finally behind us, but it wasn't getting much quieter. With the sound behind us, we figured we were in the clear, but we weren't so lucky. About 5 minutes later, we hit a log jam, and our only choice was to go ashore and carry the boat around the debris. There was one problem. We couldn't actually get out of the river. As mentioned, the river walls were 10 foot high, and our only choice was to go back up the river a couple of 100 feet to a low spot and carry it all the way round. Now, I was really dreading about getting out of the river. It's dangerous enough walking down the riverbanks in the pitch blackness, and I didn't need a zombie banshee serial killer making it worse. So we turned the boat around and head back towards the sound. We pull the boat out of the river and the sound just stops. This is it. It is definitely a serial killer taunting us, and now that we're out of the water, he's moving in for the kill. There is no more acting manly and unafraid. My friend knows I'm freaked out, and I'm sure that he is too. The boat is usually kind of heavy, but tonight it feels lighter than ever. We're practically jogging that thing down the muddy banks. Everywhere we look, we see what is ducking behind a tree and staying out of the light from our flashlights. We finally get past the log jam. We're putting the boat back in the river, and whatever is following us is right behind us. I'm in the boat, and my friend is getting in. He pushes us off out the river and runs around and yells into the darkness, "What do you want?" At this point, the Loch Ness Monster steps